Welcome. My name is Derek Stoll. I'm the Educational Horticultural Therapy Program Administrator for the UT Gardens, and today I'm going to be talking about composting. I've been composting for a while now, and really started doing that right around 2003 when I was working for AmeriCorps. And one of the tasks we had to do in local schools was teach kids about recycling, waste reduction, and composting. And so one of the things we did is every day we went into schools and we composted during the lunch. And usually we collect 1 to 3 5-gallon buckets full of compost. So what we do in a home setting will be a little bit different than that, but uh, it's fairly easy to do, and I'll give you some tips and pointers about how to do that. So today we're going to learn how to compost. We're going to see how to compost bins can be used outside or inside depending on your space available, and we're going to look at the benefits of compost in a garden. So composting is a controlled, accelerated breakdown of dead organic material. The color is dark brown or black, has an earthy smell. It is nutrient rich, and it is also a humus-like material, plant material that is broken down into stable matter. Composting is and decomposition are kind of two different things. So decomposition is when dead organic matter breaks down into simpler forms. And this is a natural process that happens just naturally outside in nature, and compost is a little different because it is usually what we consider the accelerated natural process. So it's a controlled process, and it's also done for a purpose. So why do we want to compost? So one, compost is a great soil additive. Nutrients in compost can include things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sulfur, and other micronutrients. It introduces microorganisms into the soil. It helps improve the soil structure, and also helps reduce waste in landfills. And so, I think the fact that every year about 1,200 pounds of organic material is thrown in the trash by each individual in the United States. In soil structure, so particularly in East Tennessee, we have hard clay soils, and so adding some organic material to soils helps improve that structure, also helps improve water retention, and also allows roots to grow better and helps improve your plant health overall. So some common misconceptions about compost are: one, it's difficult to do; two, compost smells; and also compost can attract rats or other animals. The fact is, when we are composting correctly and doing the work right, you're not going to have animals and rodents in your compost bin, and it's not going to smell. So what kinds of food do we want to add to compost? And so typically in a home setting, we want to be sure to add veggies, cut up vegetables, vegetable peels, banana peels, apple cores, fruits, breads, eggshells. Grass clippings work as long as you are not adding a lot of herbicides or fertilizers to your grass, because you don't want that in your compost and in a vegetable garden when you bring the compost and the soil out. Weeds that have not gone to seed are okay to put in there, and leaves. What you don't want to put in a compost bin, particularly in a home setting, is meat, dairy products, bones, animal waste, diseased plants or soil, animal byproducts, and also weeds that have gone to seed. Now, weeds that have gone to seed, one of the reasons is those seeds often don't always get broken down in the composting process, and then you end up having weeds growing in your flower beds wherever you put the compost. Large-scale compost sessions are allowed to can do meat and dairy products and bones. However, for a home setting, we're not going to have enough material together to get the temperatures high enough to compost it fast enough and to not cause problems like rodents coming in with that. So avoid putting the meat in there. But yeah, there are commercial facilities that have large-scale compost where they have large windrows of compost and big, large machines turning it often and getting the temperature really hot and can't compost meat. The University of Tennessee does collect compost, and they compost meat at their facility. Animal waste or animal byproduct is also something you don't want to necessarily put in there, typically because let's say if you have a dog or a cat or a pet at your house, a lot of times the compost, we don't get hot enough to kill those pathogens. And so I worked at one of the schools, and one of the times I was in there digging out their compost bin, I was going to try to put some of that and spread it out in their garden, and I noticed this really sticky clay-like substance. And I talked to the teacher and found out that she was putting the clay cat litter from one of the little classroom animals she had in the compost and was composting it. And so I had to just toss that out. One, clay cat litter you don't want to put in there either because it doesn't break down and it just adds more clay structure to your soil, and you don't want that. And two, because of the pathogens from the animals. Again, large-scale compost facilities, and if you own a farm, you may have cows or you may have horse manure that can be composted, and it's a great additive to your garden. However, in your home setting, like dogs and cats, you don't want to necessarily collect their waste and use a compost. So compost, how does it work? And so this is one of the most exciting things I think about composting is just seeing the process. And so it has a lot to do with bacteria. And there's several stages of bacteria. So the one is psychophilic bacteria, and these start developing around the temperatures of 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And they come in and they start breaking down the food and organic matter that you put in the pile. Over time, as that pile starts to heat up more bacteria come in and become present, and this is the mesophilic bacteria. And these bacteria are about survive at 70 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And then finally, the third stage is the thermophilic bacteria. And these are heat-loving bacteria. And this is when your compost gets really hot. And this is the kind of temperatures that you want to have to help break down any bacteria or diseases or even kill seeds so they don't germinate later when you put it in your garden. And that temperature is usually 100 to 160, sometimes 170. And so you can get a compost thermometer. I use that a lot at work in the past. And it's a fun activity to do with kids to kind of track the temperature and see how things are breaking down. However, you don't need to do that. In the summertime, particularly as you're composting, you'll be turning your compost and realizing and seeing steam coming out of it, and you can kind of feel the heat when you get down close to it, and you know that that is composting and the bacteria is working and doing its job. Other things that you might find in compost are invertebrates like ants, sow bugs, beetles, larvae, and earthworms. And all those things are part of the decomposers, and they help that decomposition happen in the compost. And by us adding the materials correctly and turning it, we're actually helping that happen a little faster. So what do we need for a compost bin? We need several things. We need browns and greens. And this typically is what people consider are things that are carbon or nitrogen based. And so the browns tend to be more higher in carbon, and greens tend to be higher in nitrogen. And so you want that ratio of 3 carbons to 1 nitrogen when you're mixing it in, and that helps it control smells a little bit, also helps it work a little better and compost faster. Bacteria and bugs, and those just show up on their own once you start putting your compost and kitchen scraps out. Air, water, and time. So again, in a compost, it'll take 1 to 2 months for that compost to start breaking down into its final stages, and you usually let it rest a little bit after that. When you start a compost bin from scratch, though, you'll be putting your kitchen scraps in there, and you will also wait about 2 weeks, and then you can start turning that. And as you turn it, it helps increase that temperature. And then they recommend about every 2 weeks to turn it to allow it for the different stages of the bacteria to start come in and work on decomposing that matter. Water. Most compost piles you don't need to add a lot of water to. Typically, if you're adding kitchen scraps, those materials have a lot of moisture in them, and so that'll help provide the moisture you need. However, at the end of a summer, particularly in East Tennessee, when we get those sort of drought periods or really dry periods in the heat, your compost pile might dry out a little bit, and you'll need to add some water into that. Browns. So some of the things that we add that we call browns tend to be things like fall leaves, pine needles, twigs, chip tree branches, and bark. You can put full sticks in there, but of course, the larger the material you put in, the longer it takes to compost, particularly sticks. So if you have a chipper, it's a great thing to have. You can take out and chip up all your branches and throw in and use them as on the compost pile. Straw or hay can work. Sawdust, corn stalks, paper, newspaper, writing paper, paper plates and napkins, coffee filters are all good to put in, and it can be considered browns. It is important to remember, though, when you're using paper, you don't want the waxy coating from like magazines. You also don't want staples or any of the plastic like windows if you're using things like mail to put in there. So when you do put the paper in, you do want to shred it up because it'll break down a little faster that way. Cotton fabric. Some people have suggested that they do that, or old clothes that are worn out. One of the challenges is you need to know what's in your clothes. So a lot of our clothes anymore have those blends with polyester and those other petroleum-based fabrics. You don't really want to have those in compost because those things do not compost they're as a plastic, they'll just kind of break down, and you'll have those microplastics, which you don't really want to have in your garden. Dry lint, the same thing. Most of our clothes have some kind of cotton and also polyester blend in them anymore, so you don't really want to necessarily compost that. Corrugated cardboard works very well. You want to make sure there's not any waxy or slick paper coatings on it. Remove those big staples that are on some boxes, and also take off any of the tape. Greens. So those things are like grass clippings. Those are very high in nitrogen, and I've done that before and just pretty much use that to put on our compost, and it works really well. However, you do want to make sure if you are putting regular treatments of herbicides or fertilizers on your garden, you want to leave those out and not put those in your compost. You can maybe spread on a vegetable garden. Coffee grounds and tea bags are excellent things to compost. Vegetables and fruit scraps, trimmings from plants, weeds that haven't set seed, eggshells, seaweed are all great things to add and add nitrogen to that compost. So how do you know compost is working? And so a lot of times we know it by the temperature. So as the temperature gets higher and over 100 degrees, you'll know that those bacteria in there eating those things up and digesting them. They'll see that steam. You'll see little to no smell. And the moisture will be fairly even throughout. And so smell is one of those things that does happen sometimes. I've found over the years that I've done composting different ways outside, and one of the ways that I did was I would just take my kitchen scraps and I would place them out there in the compost pile to start with, and I would layer them on top with grass, which is a high nitrogen thing, and I would just layer that every time through. As the pile got larger, I would just dig a little hole, put my food scraps in, and cover it back up with the grass clippings. That worked really well. I never really noticed a lot of smell with that, and it broke down really quickly. When I worked at the schools, we often used wood chips that were provided by the city, and so we put the kitchen scraps from the school lunches, and we throw wood chips on top, and we do that layer and layer, and over time we would kind of mix that. One of the things that I think happened with the wood chips though is the larger wood chips break down a lot slower, and what it also did is kind of created this little environment. There was a little bit of smell from that, and so you just have to kind of mix that up. So when it does smell, there's two main smells you kind of get when you're composting. One is a sour kind of rotten smell, and that usually happens when you have anaerobic decomposition, and so that means that the different bacteria come in place and kind of make that smell. And so what you can do is you turn your compost bin to help get oxygen into the pile. The other smell you often find is ammonia, and that a lot of times you have too much nitrogen added to it, and so you want to add some browns to that, so wood chips, leaves to your compost pile. So compost bins, there's a lot of different varieties of compost bins out there you can buy or you can build. Here are two examples. One of these examples is a tumbler compost bin. And as you can see here, I've seen them online for $100 to $400, and this one has a crank on it. So you put your compost in, and you turn it, and you mix it that way. And then when it's finished, you can turn it to where the opening goes down, and then you'll end up you pull your wheelbarrow into there and just dump all your compost in that and wheel it around the garden. On the right here, this is a 55-gallon drum made with some posts, very similar to the tumbler kind, and you can turn it, and there's some hinges on the top to put compost in, to put materials in, and have the compost come back out. Earth machines, and so these are very common type, probably some of the first commercially available compost bins I think that were out there. We have one at the UT Gardens where I work with the children's garden area, and this one I have some concerns with, this one and both of any of the enclosed ones. And so one of the things with these enclosed bins is they don't get a lot of water. When it rains, the water doesn't get in the compost, and it tends to dry out a little faster. So you do need to at times take the lid off, water it, or take the lid off before it rains to let the rainwater get in there and keep those all those compost materials moist. This one also has this lid that locks on, and that lid doesn't have any holes in it. So what I did was I just drilled a bunch of holes in it, and then there's a small seam around the middle here where when they package it, I guess they take it apart and they nest in each other. However, the one thing I tend to have with this one is as it gets full, that top part kind of pops off and becomes a hassle to deal with. The other one nice thing is it has this little door, so you can lift it up and you can get your finished compost at the bottom, pull it out with a shovel, and then go put that in your garden. Pallet compost bins are a fairly inexpensive way to compost. You know, you might want to go, when you get those, you get some bolts from the store, hardware store, and you'll put those together, and you can make 2 bins, which having 2 or 3 different bins next to each other is nice, because as the compost bin fills up, you can turn it into the other bin. And then once you turn it in the other bin, you can kind of let that sit and compost, and you can add your new kitchen scraps to the empty bin, and it allows you to have finished compost and active compost at the same time. Chicken wire. So this is what I've used a lot at home. Fairly inexpensive. There's another mesh wire that I also have right now that I'm using. The nice thing about this is you can tend to want to make it about 3 to 4 feet across, and that gives you a large enough space to have enough volume of material to compost. And then when this gets full, you can just lift up that and set it next to it, and then turn your compost right into that. And so it's an easy way to turn from there. Trash cans also work. Again, you can either cut the hole out of the bottom completely, or leave the bottom in, just drill holes all around to let water in, let air in, and it'll work a little bit like the earth machine, but a little bit less expensive. So one of the things, you know, how do you collect scraps in your home? And so what we do at our house, we bought this little compost pail. I've at times used different types of little small trash cans or little Rubbermaid containers. You know, you want to take your compost out probably daily, once or twice a day, so you don't have a lot of smells in there. This one's nice. It has, bought it online recently. It's got a little pail inside that lifts out. You can keep washing that. It also has this carbon filter on the top lid to help keep the smells out of there and keep it smelling fresh in the house. I will tell a story. We used to compost, and we ended up getting a lot of gnats, fruit flies in the house. My wife was always complaining. She always said, "Oh, is that compost?" And so we did. We quit composting for a while, and we still had the gnats. So it wasn't the compost, but having a lid on this container helps keep any little gnats or anything flying around. Also, taking it out regularly always help keep that from happening. So what's in your compost pile? So there are some things sometimes, if you're new to compost, that might kind of freak you out a little bit, you know, if you don't like insects and things. Insect larvae will move in and be part of that process. Spiders, ants, earthworms, and fruit flies. Ants tend to not be a problem unless sometimes they'll try to put a nest in there. And that tends to happen more when the compost is really dry. So if you see a lot of ants, and check and see if the moisture is like in that pile, most likely you'll need to just turn the water hose onto it, turn it up a little bit, and disturb it enough where the ants aren't going to want to stay in there, and they'll move out. Earthworms will just come in naturally, and fruit flies. What I tend to do is when I bring out my food scraps every day is cover them up, and that'll kind of reduce the fruit flies, particularly if you keep them from flying in your face. At the gardens, somebody has been putting some compost in the earth machine and haven't been covering it up, so you open it up and you get a burst of fruit flies in your face. So I was over there the other week, and I just went ahead and put some mulch on top of that. One of the larvae that I see a lot in compost piles is this soldier fly larva, and it's a beneficial insect, so it's great to have. It's a great decomposer. Also, the larva on the right looks a little bit like a mealworm, and sometimes they'll show up a lot, and you'll have a bunch of them in there, and they'll be crawling around. And so that's kind of a little creepy for some people, but the nice thing is they are doing a great job at composting and breaking down some of that material that you have in there in your compost pile. So some other things just about outside composting. Again, it usually takes a couple months before you get finished compost. The other thing you need to think about is, one, if you're looking at a household, you're not going to necessarily produce enough compost in your home to completely fill up your whole garden bed. And so it's a great supplement. It reduces waste. It's excellent to have. But you might need to add some other soil, other amendments, other compost that you can get from garden centers to your gardens over time, because again, it takes a lot. What you'll notice is, you know, when you have your scraps out there, they'll reduce in size considerably as they start breaking down and as that moisture leaves them and they start turning into that compost. So one other way to compost is vermicomposting. And this is the use of worms or compost worms to create compost. This can be done inside or outside, so that's a neat benefit, particularly if you do not have a yard. If you live in an apartment, you can still compost. And so to get started, you need a couple things. You need a worm bin, you need some worms, and some food. Now, where do you get the worms is going to be important. You don't want to necessarily go out in your backyard, start digging up your earthworms or night crawlers. I have seen teachers do that before. They went to the fish store and got some earthworms, fishing worms, and threw in there. And they don't really work that well. So that's why I wouldn't necessarily recommend them. We end up using a product, the worms called red wigglers, and we'll talk more about those and where to get some in just a minute. So worm bins, there's all kinds of them, from fairly expensive systems like this one on the left. This is a stackable system, and so each little layer has this bin, and in the bottom of the bin, it's a mesh plastic piece, and you put that down at the bottom, and you start off by putting your food scraps in there, and the worms will be in there, and they'll eat all the food scraps. As that fills up with compost, you add the second layer. And then that next layer, you'll put your food in, that scraps in there, and the worms will crawl up through those holes. And so it's an easy way to harvest the worm castings. Up here, this is just a Rubbermaid container with holes drilled in it. This one is a wooden structure, very similar to the stackable ones. And this is another Rubbermaid container that they have with stackable sections, I think, also where the holes drilled in where the worms can crawl up through. These are very priced, obviously, and then this store-bought one here has a spout or spigot, so where you can put water and pour it through this. That water will drain to the bottom, and then it'll kind of create what they call compost tea. You can open that up into this brown liquid that you can use to fertilize houseplants with. So again, these are some of those bins, a little cedar bin, Rubbermaid bins. And so really it's going to depend upon your budget and the space you have of what kind of bin you want. This wooden one might be one you'd put outside. These stackable ones, if you have a closet or space like that, would be fine. Rubbermaid ones can fit even under some kitchen sinks and cabinets in the kitchen or in a closet. So most important though is when you're selecting a bin, use what works for your space and your budget. Plastic bins are cheap. You know, if you are a parent or if you're a grandparent and you have kids around, you can have them help you build one, and it'd be a little fun afternoon activity. So where do we get earthworms? So most earthworms that we find in the ground here are actually imported from Europe over the years, particularly early settlers as they brought plants over, they introduced those. Earthworms are excellent for gardens. They help aerate, they provide castings. However, as earthworms get into natural areas, woods, and mountains, there has been issues with them damaging the plant life there because they eat so much and will eat some of that layers of organic matter that drops and is in the forest floor. So it has caused some problems there. But in our gardens, we love them. But what we tend to use are these worms called Acinitas dentatas. These are red wigglers or tiger worms, another name also panworms. They're a little smaller than regular earthworms, and they're also a little bit redder, a little red in color. And so they also are very good eaters, and so they eat a lot more, eat a little bit faster than other worms, which makes them perfect for composting. So you can buy them online. Or you can find a friend that has a worm bin and see if they'll give you some. They start reproducing if you have a healthy bin composting, and you can take some out and give those to somebody else even when you get it. So a couple websites I've looked at is the Worm Farm, Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, redworms.com. And again, I think for me, I'd buy about 1,000 worms for around 20 or 30 bucks plus shipping. So it's fairly inexpensive. Red wigglers work well because they feed close to the surface. They tend to eat their weight in food every day, and they also reproduce very quickly. So how many worms do you need? So what you need to do, or what you can do at first, is measure your compost. How much vegetable, fruit scraps do you have, food scraps you have each day, and weigh it. And so about a pound a day, you need about a pound of worms. And also, if you produce about that much a day, you want about 1 square foot of worm bin. So this calculation comes from a textbook by Mary Applehoff, Worms Eat My Garbage, and you can kind of order that online if you'd like to learn a little bit more details about worm composting. So to start the bin, so you need to start off with some bedding. So that tends to be things like shredded paper that's gotten wet, that you've wetted, peat moss. Again, you want to make sure it's wet because the worms will dry up and they need a little bit of moisture, but they don't need too much moisture. You would layer that. So you put your bedding down at the bottom, you put some food, you put your worms in, you put some bedding on top, and just make sure you keep it moist. So I have a spray bottle that I use to mist it if it starts drying out and getting too dry. What kinds of food do you want to compost? So vegetables and fruit trimmings are fine. You might want to start slow. You don't want to add too much at one time. Eggshells are great. Food chopped up is better because the worms can eat it faster. It breaks down a little faster. Things you want to avoid are no citrus, no salty foods, no fatty foods, because worms, the citrus will burn them, the salt will also burn them, and fatty foods are just hard for them to break down. Breads are okay. However, they mold a little quicker than the worms can eat them sometimes. So if you do that, you just be prepared to have a lot of blue bread in there. And so I usually tend to avoid that. I put things like rice in there again. Kind of gets a little funky smelling because it takes a little longer for the worms to eat those. Harvesting worm bins. And so that is becomes a question of how to do that. So if you have the stackable system, it kind of does it itself as the worms climb up to the top. You can do it by hand, and so red wigglers don't like light. And so what you'll do is you put the your worm contents on a table, dump it out, and then you get a little light and place it over top of that. And what you can do is scrape off the top. Over time, those worms will keep crawling down to the bottom of the pile, and you can scrape off the top and kind of look there and make sure you don't have any worms. By the time you're done, you'll end up with a big ball or mass of worms kind of climbing around each other. And then you can just put those back in the worm bin. Sifting, so you can get a 1/4 inch mesh screen and sift it. That usually keeps the worms from falling through. And then you can get the compost out that way. Also, another way it works is if you have a large bin, you can put the food in one corner and they'll kind of crawl to that corner, and then a couple days later you can start harvesting the other side. There's a couple videos that I found that work that are show you how to do that, so I'm going to see if we can get those to work.
Jeff here from wormsword.com. Today I'm going to demonstrate a worm sifting tray. Now I made this myself. I made it out of 4 2-foot 2x4s with galvanized 1/4 inch mesh screen. I used 1/2 inch aluminum strips to secure the screen to the bottom, as well as screws to hold together the 2x4s. You can make this for around 20 bucks. Now I had most of the materials laying around. The only thing I had to buy was the 1/2 inch aluminum strips. You'll probably need like a jigsaw to cut the aluminum. Measure to length. You buy this in a roll or to length. You know, you buy 3 feet because you're only going to need 2 feet. And you cut the screen and just build your box. Screw it together, attach this, and you're ready to start. So this is how you use one of these bad boys. First thing you need to do is dig out your compost, put it in a bucket, pour into the tray. And now this is where you're going to have to use some muscle here. This isn't mechanical, you're the mechanical on this one. Just pick it up and shake. Now as you can see, it separated the finer pieces from the clumps. You'll find some worms here. Plenty of eggshells from parts of the compost.
Alright, so that is one way you can work on separating your compost and or vermicompost for yourself. Then I'm going to also kind of show one more video. So there are large-scale kind of commercial worm composting facilities where they do compost things like meat and other materials with lots of worms. And this is a video of a place where the guy made a worm tumbler to kind of compost or how to separate his worms.
Good morning, everybody. I've had a lot of questions on how we harvest the worms, so I'm going to give you the quick and easy on how a worm harvester works to give you a better idea of what happens. This is a worm harvester. Basically, we take a scoopful of our worm castings out of here and we toss it in this. It has a slide angle, and this is one of the things we adjust to get things working just right as we go along through the day. I'll probably adjust the angle of this thing 2 or 3 times. The wetness of the feed stock is going to affect what angle we run it at, and a lot of other factors, so it's nothing that you just said and it's done. With that said, the worms are going to work their way down into this screen part here. Now in the screen, this is where we're going to lose most of our material in the process. All of the small stuff is going to drop through, including the eggs, it's the really baby worms, so on and so forth. But most of the worms will make it through to this end. This end is the working end right here. This is where all of the separating is done. If you remember when you were a kid and you tried to go down a slide with shorts on, do you remember how you would stick to the slide and you know, you couldn't go anywhere? That's kind of the same theory on how this works here. The worms and the bigger material are going to come into this section, and the big stuff is going to run straight through. It's not going to stick to the slide. But the worms, when they cross through this, they're going to get that same effect where they get stuck to the slide. It's going to carry them up onto the edge, and that's going to bring them off to the other side where they can drop into the bin away from everything else. And so let's fire this thing up. I'm going to have Bob throw a pitchfork in for us, and we'll follow a couple loads down through the process. Here we go. Okay, so here we go. We've thrown another pitchfork of worms in. They're working their way through the screen. All of the small stuff is dropping through. Coming back to the working end. And the big nuggets drop off to the side. And the worms are all riding a little slide up the side and dropping off on the far side.
So again, that's kind of a large-scale composting situation. So you probably won't be doing that at home, but it's kind of interesting to see how they do separate worms at a facility like that. So there's some benefits to worm castings, even a little bit above and beyond just compost. And so one, vermicompost has been shown through research to prevent plant diseases. The microbes in the soil have been shown to protect, or in the compost, have been shown to protect seeds from pathogens. And one of those pathogens is Pythium affinidatum, and this is a disease that causes the damping off disease. And so this is one of the diseases you have a lot of times when you're starting seeds, particularly when the moisture or the soil's cool and there's too much moisture, and this bacteria will kill the seedling very quickly. And so this Cornell study we found, they found that this, by helping just adding worm compost to seedlings, it helps reduce that bacteria and helps improve the health of the plants. These are a couple of the research articles about that, so it's composting with worms. You can go back and look, and this news.cornell.edu was the research study that they talked about. That you can look at a little bit further. I do want to thank everybody for watching. I do also want to just thank our sponsors of our education program, particularly UT Federal Credit Union, Publix, Algae Asthma Affiliates, and the Algae Asthma and Sinus Center. If you do have any questions after watching this about compost that you would like to ask, feel free to email me. My email is dstowell@utk.edu. And you can send me an email, and I'll try to answer your questions as best as possible. Be looking for other UT Gardens programs we'll be offering online throughout the summer, and happy gardening.